Hello, my name is David, and today I will be presenting the Kropff and Treves theory of grid cells. Grid cells were first discovered over a decade ago, and since then many people have studied them. So I'm going to assume that you already know the basics about what a grid cell is. This model of grid cells is highly compatible with Numenta's theories. The model is very similar to a spatial pooler, however they describe their model using different terminology and different equations. I will be restating their work in terms which should be more understandable to anyone who's familiar with Numenta's work. The model makes an assumption about how the world works. The model assumes that you are moving through the world. The model also assumes that consecutive sensory inputs are physically adjacent in the world. The model uses these assumptions to piece together where things are located in the world and how they're connected to each other. The grid cells are modeled as a modified spatial pooler. These assumptions are turned into mathematical equations which act as a small bias on the spatial pooler's activity. The bias causes the spatial pooler to do grid cells. It turns the spatial pooler into grid cells. Here we see several of the spatial pooler's equations. It is not critical that you understand these equations. The first line describes the input to the spatial pooler. In plain English, what this equation says is that each cell in the spatial pooler adds up all of the inputs which coincide with a synapse to that cell, which is the overlap function. Then that overlap function is passed through another function f, which is the subject of this presentation. The second line describes how cells compete to activate, using the result of the function f as their competitive strength. There are three different options for the function f, each used by different cell types. If f is the identity function, then you get a normal spatial pooler. The function f can also be a low-pass filter, or a combination of low and high-pass filters which yields grid cells. This is a diagram of a low-pass filter. Grid cells use a simple exponential moving average. The red line is the input to the filter, and the blue line is the output of the filter. The low-pass filter removes small and fast changes from the input, but allows larger and longer-lasting changes to pass through it. It also delays all changes to the input before transmitting them to the output. This is a diagram of a high-pass filter. It uses an exponential moving average as well. The high-pass filter allows all changes to the input to pass through it immediately, but persistent inputs are removed, and over a long period of time the output of the high-pass filter tends towards zero. Here we see the combined low and high-pass filters. The result includes aspects of both of the filters. Now let's discuss the low-pass filter. Grid cells respond to areas of the world, which are also known as receptive fields. Grid cell receptive fields have many interesting properties. They're circular, they repeat in a hexagonal grid, and they are all about the same size. Grid cell receptive fields pose problems which the spatial pooler can't solve alone. You see, the response of the spatial pooler has a property called semantic similarity. Semantic similarity, if you're unfamiliar, is a measure of similarity between two sets of neural activity, defined as the fraction of neurons which are active in both sets of activity. The spatial pooler is capable of preserving any semantic similarity in its inputs. The spatial pooler output can reflect the semantic aspects of its input while removing the noise in the input which doesn't have any semantic meaning. This is useful for recognizing sensory inputs which are noisy or distorted. However, the spatial pooler cannot create new semantic similarities. It can only work with the semantic similarities which already exist in its inputs. If you show a spatial pooler two inputs which have no similarities, then the outputs will also have little to no similarity. Now, some grid cells can respond to areas which are significantly larger than any of their inputs. The inputs on opposite sides of a grid cell's receptive field could be relatively far apart, and they could have little to no semantic overlap in their inputs. when a grid cell responds to a large area of the world, it is assigning a semantic similarity to all of those locations within that large receptive field. The low-pass filter is responsible for making the large receptive fields, which are larger than the input receptive fields. The low-pass filter works by making grid cells change their activity slower than their inputs are changing. That's the delay happening. It causes grid cells to remain active even after all of their inputs have turned off. And when a cell is active, it uses Hebbian learning to form synapses with all of the currently active inputs, which further reinforces that cell's activity. In this way, when a grid cell activates, it remains active while you move through the world, and then that grid cell will associate with all of those areas of the world. The low-pass filter is a mathematical way of saying perhaps you are still located at the same place where you were located a moment ago. This is an assumption, and of course it is not always correct. The strength of this assumption is related to the exponential time period of the low-pass filter. Let's look at an example of this process in action. This example is not about grid cells, but rather this is a demonstration of the low-pass filter. I'll bet you've never seen this type of coin before. When you look at this coin for the first time, a random and unique set of cells in your brain will activate in response to seeing it. Over time, that set of cells will use Hebbian learning to associate with the visual sensations of this coin. And now you have learned a unique representation of this coin, and there are cells in your brain which respond only to this image. Here's the other side of the coin. And now here the same process of learning a unique representation is happening. However, because of the low-pass filter, some of the cells which responded to the heads side of the coin are still active while you look at the tails side of the coin, and those cells are becoming part of your representation of the tails side of the coin. And now I'm going to flip the coin a few times. When I flipped the coin back and forth, cells which represented one side of the coin activated and remained active while you looked at the other side of the coin. Those cells then learned to respond to both sides of the coin because they were active while you looked at both sides of the coin. Now you have formed a representation of both sides, a unique representation of the coin. And in the future, you can recognize this coin regardless of which side you're looking at. Without the low-pass filter, this would be impossible. A spatial pooler on its own can't do this because the two sides of the coin look totally different, and so they have no semantic similarity in their sensory inputs. Now let's discuss that high-pass filter. Kropff and Treves call it fatigue, and they use a different name for it. The high-pass filter turns off grid cells after they've been active for a certain period of time. If you are moving, then a period of time equates to a physical distance. Therefore, the high-pass filter turns off grid cells after you've moved a certain distance. Grid cells measure distances by combining the assumption that you're moving with the grid cell's internal measurement of time, and that internal measure of time is derived from the high-pass filter. By turning grid cells off after you've moved a certain distance, the high-pass filter shapes their receptive fields into circles. The radius of the circle is controlled by how fast you are moving and by how quickly the grid cells become fatigued. The high-pass filter is a mathematical way of saying, it's been a while, so you've probably moved to a new location. This works in any number of dimensions. The high-pass filter shapes the grid cell receptive fields into n-dimensional spheres. And of course, a circle is a two-dimensional sphere. If your movement is irregular, then the grid cell receptive fields will have irregular shapes. By irregular, I mean that your movement speed is not always the same. For example, animals typically slow down before they run headfirst into a wall. This causes the grid cell receptive fields near the corners of rooms to be smaller than the receptive fields which are far away from any obstacles or obstructions. The effects of irregular movement have been observed in vivo recordings from real live animals. Grid cells compete to activate just as they do in a spatial pooler. The competitive pressure helps pack the grid cell receptive fields into a tight formation. And if you pack many spheres into an area, then naturally they form themselves into a hexagonal lattice. And this works in simulation. This figure is from the Kropff and Treves 2008 publication. The first two rows of images show the receptive fields of some of their simulated grid cells. Each of these images represents a single grid cell. The x and y dimensions of these images represent a two-dimensional arena where a simulated mouse runs freely. The light polka dots are the areas where the grid cells activate. The other images in the figure are just some further analyses of the grid cells. I modified a Numenta spatial pooler with low and high pass filters to create these images of grid cells. The figures on the left are the receptive fields of simulated grid cells. Although my reproduction does not work as well as the original Kropff and Treves implementation, it clearly demonstrates the important aspects of grid cells. Notice that the receptive fields are round, they have clearly delineated borders, they are solidly filled, they are uniformly sized, and they are evenly spaced. And now I'd like to talk about something else other than grid cells. Numenta published a theory about how the cortex recognizes objects. According to this theory, the cortex uses two groups of cells to do this. One group of cells, called the input layer, recognizes sensory features on the object. A second group of cells, called the output layer, associates all of the sensory features on an object with a single representation of the object. The result of this two-layer model is a system which can recognize objects regardless of how you sense the object. The example they use in their paper is of touching an object at different locations on the object. Their model is able to recognize the object by touching it in several different places. Every time their simulated hand touches the object, their model gains information about it, and eventually it deduces which object it's touching. Every touch of the object at a different location on the object feels different and yields a different set of input layer activity. But the resulting output layer activity is a single set of cells which respond to the object, and the output layer does not change its activity when the simulated hand moves around the input object. The input layer can keep moving around the object and the input layer can keep changing, but the output layer converges to a single stable representation. This property is known as viewpoint invariance. The output layer is stable with respect to the location of the sensory organ. However, the Numenta model is incomplete. They require that while learning a new object, the output layer needed to be told that it was learning a new object. And then they held the activity of the output layer constant while it was learning the new object. This was their solution to overcome the spatial pooler's inability to create semantic similarity in situations where the inputs don't have any similarities to begin with. A better solution is, of course, for the output layer to use a low-pass filter. To test this idea, I started with Numenta's two-layer model, and I altered the output layer to include a low-pass filter. The objects which I tasked the model with learning were words. I started with 500 random words from the English dictionary, and I fed the words into the model many times in random order. And I fed them into the model one character at a time. Each character in the alphabet, A through Z, was given a unique sensory representation. The purpose of this experiment was to see if the model could identify the boundaries between the words on its own with no outside help. So I removed any hints as to where the boundaries between the words might be. The model was not shown any spaces, punctuation, or changes in capitalization. The model was not reset between words either. Here's how I quantified how well the model worked. I will explain these metrics while we look at the results on the next slide. I trained the model for a time without supervision and then plotted the results. In this diagram, the x-axis is time. At the bottom of the diagram are the words which I showed to the model. The vertical black lines show the true boundaries between words. I drew these vertical lines to make it easier for you to understand this diagram, but let me repeat, the model was not shown these indicators of where the word boundaries were. The blue line is the stability. The stability is the fraction of cells which remained active between consecutive moments in time. I did some basic post-processing on the stability to make trends in it more clear. I had hypothesized that while looking at a single word, the output layer would have a high degree of stability. And in between words, the output layer should have a low stability as it is changing its activity to reflect the next word. These results confirm this hypothesis. You can clearly see that the word boundaries, as shown by the vertical black lines, often coincide with a steep decline in the stability, which is the blue line. There is greater stability within the interior of the words than in between the words. However, the model does occasionally fail, as can be seen with the words detest and spates, where the word changed but the stability did not drop. I also trained a statistical classifier to identify the current word based on the activity in the output layer. The output of the statistical classifier is shown at the top of the diagram as the words which are sideways. The classifier was only trained on the final character in each word. If the classifier is able to recognize a word before the final character of the word, it is because there are some active cells which were active throughout the sensation of the word. The purpose of the statistical classifier was to determine if the stable cells contained meaningful information. This theory may seem simple, but the implementation is actually rather complicated. If you try to implement these ideas, you will run into all sorts of details. Details which you will need to sort out before it will work correctly. The models which I've presented here only have proximal dendrites. The distal dendrites account for the majority of synapses onto neurons. In theory, distal dendrites should cause grid cells to align with each other and to accurately tessellate into a repeating pattern. Distal dendrites are also likely involved in integrating your knowledge of your own movements into the grid cell's activity. However, the details of how distal dendrites interact with grid cells are still murky, and so these things remain hypothetical. I hope this has been informative, and thank you for your time.